Roostertail Talk, a podcast dedicated to everything related to the sport we all love, hydroplane racing. I'm your host, David Newton, and it's time once again, so sit back, relax, and welcome to Roostertail Talk. It is May 26th, and this is episode 36. A few weeks ago, I had the opportunity to sit down and talk with Dave Villwock over the phone. We talked for some time about hydroplanes, his involvement in the sport. Obviously, he made a big name for himself in Unlimiteds in many ways, but it was nice to talk to him about his days before reaching the Unlimited ranks, his decisions on entering into the sport of hydroplane racing, his years with Circus Circus, some of his career highlights, and we even talked for a little while on his hobby of model radio-controlled airplanes. Today I'm joined with hydroplane racing legend Dave Villwock via phone. How are you doing, Dave?
So far, so good. Every day I get up is a good day.
Yes. It's good. It's always good to be vertical, right?
Yes. Above ground.
Above ground. There we go. Well, how are you keeping yourself busy in this time of solitude, I guess? Are you able to still work, or how are you staying busy?
Well, I'm other than trying to build a few propellers for some people and helping Kelly out with his new adventure a little bit, I haven't done much, but so we're building a few propellers for a few people, a few teams, and trying to get through that. Yeah. And hopefully they'll lift the Great Depression off of us and the world can get back to doing something again. So
I hope so. I hope we can do some fun things here this summer coming up.
Yeah, let's hope so.
Well, I know you've been around here, Seattle, for a while, and like myself, so I was curious, talking with people around the sport, if they've had any idols growing up around hydroplane racing, if you had any favorite drivers when you were growing up around the sport.
Yeah, lots of them. Not necessarily directed at Unlimiteds, because I never thought that a guy like me would ever do something like that, but when I was growing up, I remember my uncle was good friends with George Henley.
Okay.
And they raced in the 225 class. So when I was, 8 or 9 years old, we'd go to a race someplace and we'd stop by George's house on the way back. And I remember standing in the mist tide air, and George was one of the top running 225 guys at the time. So when he made it to Unlimiteds and he was somebody to watch. However, at the same time, he was the guy that told me when he was driving the Burien Miss, I think was it. Mm-hmm. It's an old conventional hull, and I went up to him at Seattle and I said, "Wow, George, this is really awesome. You made it here." And he goes, "Oh, I don't know." He says, "It's just about breaking me to do this, I don't recommend it, and I really developed opinion from that. From that, I went, oh, you can follow your dreams, but at the same time, be careful with your pocketbook.
Oh, yeah.
That you can get yourself into trouble following just a dream without respect to that. So for that reason, I stayed out of Unlimiteds for a long time, or refused offers to do things, either working on the boats or driving the boats, and it wasn't until Circus Circus that changed. But him, Bill Muncie, guys like Lynn Montgomery was a 7-liter guy that was a great guy. Glenn Davis, was always a guy that was always had a helping hand. Steve Jones, he was another guy that was a great flat bottom racer and designer. So all those guys I looked up to.
Yeah, there's a wealth of hydroplane drivers around the sport that have been so influential. So it's always fun to hear, which side, people idolize, I guess, right?
Yeah.
Well, I know a lot of people know so much about your Unlimiteds career, but to be honest, I don't know a lot of your background before you got to Circus Circus. I know you kind of made it big as a crew chief there and went on to a really great Unlimiteds career, but I was wondering if you could talk to the fans out there and let them know a little bit more about your days before Unlimiteds.
Well, when I got into it probably because my Uncle Al, of all things, because he was racing boats. And from the kid growing up on the farm in Port Orchard, boats looked way cooler than cows, and more fun to work on than a tractor, So, I would go into my uncle's house and help him, sweep the floor and things like that. And, so naturally I grew up into things. And then when my cousin and I got old enough to drive or be in the boats, and I think that was like 14 or 15 at the time, you could ride. You couldn't drive yet, but you could ride in a boat. My uncle decided to go get a cracker box. So we did that. And so we ran in that class for a number of years and ended up as more of a family endeavor with my uncle, my brother, and my cousin. We got a hold of the lemon crate quite by accident and managed to, win a national championship and a lot of national points championships and stuff like that. And then I moved on to racing flat bottoms and happened to get hooked up with a guy by the name of Steve Jones and the Starfire boat thing, and that became very successful. We were doing better than most around the country, and went on to win a lot of national championships, set a lot of world's records and things like that. And then a guy that had a Chevrolet dealership down in Sumner, named was Jerry Yoder, and his partner was Ray Sparling. They'd been helping, pay for gas and things like that over the years. And we'd done about everything you could do in flat bottom racing. We'd set all the records. We'd won on all the national championships. We'd end points championships and all of that stuff. And Jerry said one day, why don't we race a hydroplane? I thought, okay. And so we did. And we raced that for a couple of years, and we did some stuff along with Ron Jones and Ron Jones Marine that was pretty new in terms of skid fin orientation and rudder placement and stuff like that. And I fabricated a lot of stuff that was very different from everybody else. And that's really what got me involved in unlimited racing. Was I'd done some things with Ron Jones Sr. and Jr. And when the Circus team and the Miller team were together along with Prevost, he had watched the things we'd done in flat bottom racing, and he'd seen our hydroplane at a few races before he went to Unlimited. And so he called me up and says, hey, would you come down? I'd like you to, I know you're a fabricator, would you, build the stuff that you did on your boat on what was the Circus Circus boat or one of the Miller boats. And we're putting a capsule on it too, so maybe he can help out with that, because he knew I'd helped Ron with some of his capsule installations early on with like the 7-Eleven and whatnot. And so they, I said, well, and going back to George Henley, I says, I've been pretty careful not to get very involved in that, so I don't really think I want to, go get involved with Unlimiteds. And he goes, okay, well, I appreciate it. I just thought I'd try. We need to do a lot of stuff here in the next 6 weeks. Okay. Well, thanks, John. And off he went. And then about a day passed, he called back and says, I understand that you don't want to work on the boat. I understand that, but he says, would anybody on your crew like to come down and work on our boat? And I knew a guy that worked for us that had crewed on the flat bottoms and the hydroplane. And I knew he was running his own little business, and he needed a little work. And so I says, well, sure. A guy that works on a crew, I can send him down there. And so I did. And then another couple of days passed. Then that guy called up and said, his name was Paul. Paul called up and said, hey, I don't know exactly how to do this. Can you come down and help me? And so I could say no to Prevost, but I couldn't say no to him because he'd been working on my boats for years for free. So I got down there. Well, what happened then is I'm sitting there, I'm watching some of the things they're doing, and I'm installing the skid fin bracketry and whatnot. And then I ended up, the guy that was working on the capsule quit, and so I welded up some of that to finish that up for their structure in there and whatnot, and got to know a few people around that shop during that time. And about that time, Hanauer walked in, and and I said hi because I knew Hanauer from Limited Racing back when he did that, and talked to him a little bit. And I'd been watching some of the things they were doing with some of the airfoils on the boat, and angle of attack of airfoils that were on the boat that they were putting on. And of course, since I didn't care, I wasn't trying to get a job there. When Henry walked in, I just asked him, I says, "Hey, are you going to drive this boat ever?" And he goes, "Well, if Rivos isn't in town, yeah, I probably qualified or something if he doesn't make it in."
Yeah.
I ran it before. I think I won he said I won the Gold Cup with it and whatnot, And and I says, "Don't get in it. It's going to crash."
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And he goes, "Well, what do you mean?" And I says, "Well, the angle of attack of the front wing and stuff, when that thing, gets enough air, goes fast enough, my guess is 175, 180, it's leaving."
Yeah.
And this was after the Budweiser really had their boat running, and they had done much the same thing where they had an airfoil on the boat at the time, and I went down, Ron Jones Jr. and I went down to put the deck on the boat because it was a new sponsor. There were the new big sponsors, and the crew was kind of frazzled because they'd been working for weeks and had to finish this boat up on time. So we went there at nights to get the rest of that sponsor installed and the deck installed, and I was around there looking at a wing. And I told, and this was before the circus thing happened, I went and looked at it and says, asked Ron Brown, I said, "Ronnie," I says, "what's up with this wing up here?" "Oh," he says, "it's going to, as the boat goes faster, it's going to fly down harder." And I says, "Yeah, but if it bounces up, the wind's going to separate off of that, and it's going to be over at that time."
Mm-hmm.
And he goes, "Well, we spent $50,000 on that wing." I says, "Well, okay, I'm just a guy working here. What do I know?" And the answer, maybe one of the things, I when I grew up in from starting the third grade, my interest in model airplanes had brought me into paying attention to what the space shuttle did and how they were planning on flying that vehicle down and changing from sonic speeds to subsonic speeds and whatnot, and how they worked on leading edges and stuff. And the American Modeling Association did a great deal of articles with NASA. They were promoting NASA, but they're also teaching. And there were some really, really bright people involved in that. And in fact, I fly model airplanes with a guy that was a model builder for that vehicle.
Oh,
and
wow.
They were dropping them from model airplanes and trying to fly them down, glide them down to a runway. So they're learning about a full lifting body.
Okay.
And that was one thing that I saw the sport differently. Most people saw the sport as a ram wing, and that's what Ron looked at it as, that ram wing that traps air. That's where everything happens.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, it's a major part of it, but the whole vehicle is a lifting vehicle, and it works as a unit. And Ron and I had a lot of talks about that, and that's where the shapes came from, like the circus boat and all of that was discussions about that. And so I knew that something bad was going to happen if it bounced out. Well, the first time the Budweiser boat went out to test it at Seattle, Cropfield left the pit area, went across the course, turned, went around the corner, came up, hit his own wake, bounced up, and blew over.
That's right. Yeah. That's
and Ron Brown turned around and looked at me, and I just shrugged. And so when the circus boat, I saw some of the things they were doing, and they had some good foils, but they were on at a high angle, and so that's why I said that. Well, of course, about 6 weeks later, they went down to San Diego, and that's the double blowover you saw.
That's right. I was going to say, yeah, you called that one too. That was...
Yeah, and so, and that's when the interest came up, and I kind of, I talked to Chip and Fran, who called me, and I said, "Geez, I don't know. It's a pretty big step to get involved in those things because your life is going to change." And back at that point in time, I was a superintendent at a large sheet metal shop. I could fly model airplanes. I could race boats at a high level. life was pretty good if I didn't screw it up somehow, And so, I wasn't very excited about getting started on that. Well, then about a few days later, after Fran and Chip had went down to talk to Bennett at the race in Las Vegas, I got a call in the middle, about 8 o'clock at night. And the person on the phone, says, "Hi, this is Bill Bennett." It says, "You may have heard of me." and I says, "Yes, sir, I have. Both from my flight model airplanes and from that field because he owns Circus Circus Hobbies.
Yeah.
And from the boating side, I'd seen that too. So I knew him from a couple of different angles.
Mm-hmm.
And he goes, I understand you're a little tentative about wanting to get involved in unlimiteds." I says, yeah, that's true. You mind if I ask you why? And I says, "Mr. Bennett, I find that unlimited hydroplanes are overexpected and underfunded to that end. Mm-hmm. So for that reason, I've tried to stay away from getting too involved." And he goes, "I can understand that." He says, "Well, can I ask you to do me a favor?" And of course, I didn't know to say yes to a guy like that. And so, I'm sitting there and it was dead silent for about 10 seconds. And I'm thinking my little computer and my little brain is whirring as fast as it can. And I finally figure out that for a guy like that, when a guy like Bill Gates calls you in the middle of the night and asks you for a favor, you say yes.
Right.
Even if he doesn't tell you what the favor is, And so I says, "Sure, Mr. Bennett, what can I do for you?" And he says, if you could just go down to my shop and take a notebook and, I'll call the guys down there and just walk around and just look at everything and tell me what I need to do. And I says, "Sure, I can do that." He says, "Okay, well, when do you want to come down?" I says, "Well, I don't know." He says, "I'll send a jet for you." Okay. And so I go down and I look at that stuff, and he sends the plane up, and I have to ride back with Mrs. Bennett, mm-hmm. Samantha Bennett, at the time. So that was a little scary too.
Yeah.
And so I get down there, and they put me in a nice suite. And the next morning I get up and I go to he didn't have a huge office. I went in there and I kind of went over the things that we needed to do, and went over where he was. He had, one boat that was busted in two, which they just crashed. Another one that wasn't really competitive. He had a bunch of engine parts, of which really only a couple of them really were worth anything between the two boats. He only had a couple of engines, and he had one burned up gearbox and I think one good gearbox. So things weren't all that good, but I just went down and gave him that brief little rundown of what things he needed to work on. I said, "You don't have any propeller program at all. Stuff they're running is making it like a heat or two before it breaks, they say." So, and he goes, "Okay." He says, "Well, thank you very much for doing that. I appreciate it." He says, "Anything in town here you want to do?" And I said, "No." I didn't, I wasn't, I'd just flown down there to do that, and he goes, "Well," he says, "well, when do you want to go home?" Then I says, "Well, I'd never been on a private plane before." I says, "Well, I guess whenever the plane leaves." And he goes, "Oh, hell," he says, "that thing will leave any damn time you want it to." He says, "But, you said you were a modeler." He says, "I got this guy, Donnie, that works for me. His name is Donnie White." So he says, "He builds airplanes for me every Saturday. I go out to my ranch and we fly model airplanes. And, we got plenty of airplanes down there. If you'd like to come out and fly with us, I'd love to have you."
Cool.
And I thought, in the whole start of this thing, I thought there has to be a free model radio in this someplace.
Yeah.
And I thought we're getting a little closer to that free model radio. So I said, "Sure, I'd love to do that." So we went out there. We flew model airplanes till about 2 or 3 o'clock, and he never once mentioned anything about the boat. Just talked about model airplanes. And then finally he says, "Well, I'm getting a little tired." He said, "I think I'm going to head home." He says, "Donnie here will take you to the hangar. And he put you on your way, so I really appreciate it. I really appreciate you coming down." I says,
Yeah.
Well, thank you. I appreciated the time out here at the ranch, and that's I enjoyed that too. Thank you. So he goes off and he gets in his car, and I'm helping this guy Donnie pick up and put models in his van to take home, things he had to work on.
Mm-hmm.
And Bennett he gets in his car and he rolls by and he rolls down the window and he says, he says, I kind of like you. He says, you ought to reconsider the offer I made you. He says, you could pretty much write your own ticket. And I says, well, thank you, Mr. Bennett. I really appreciate that. I enjoyed your company too, again. And, I'll think about that. He says, thank you. He says, do that. And he rolled his window up and he went home. Well, on my plane ride back, I thought, I always said I wouldn't get involved because it was underfunded and underorganized.
Mm-hmm.
And I got a guy sitting here that says that he wants to do the right things, and I kind of got along with him. I says, so I thought about it. I thought, and I thought to myself, I'd be a coward if I didn't at least pursue to tell him what he needs to do in detail
mm-hmm.
to win, to mm-hmm. go beat Budweiser. What do you have to do to go beat Budweiser? Because that's a tall order.
Oh, yeah.
And so I said, I thought it, gave it the 24-hour think soak.
Mm-hmm.
And I called him back the next day and I says, Mr. Bennett, I said, I thought about what you said. And I says, and I just said just what I just told you. I says, I'd be a coward if I didn't offer to go down and really put together a 3-year program on what it was going to take to take you from where you are broken and non-competitive to beating the Budweiser operation.
Mm-hmm.
Would you want me to put together what it would take to do that? And he goes, oh, hell, I've been trying to get somebody to do that for years. He says, just and make sure whatever you need to put in there. Okay. Wow. So I thought, well, okay, here I go. I guess I'm going to go look at this. So he said, I'll call the guys down at the shop. You go down and do whatever you want there. Okay. So he did. And I went down there and put together a program over the next couple of weeks and put in there what I wanted, which I figured was going to be renegotiated. So I put a little more than I figured because I figured I hadn't even been to these race sites. I'm probably going to get fired in the first 3 months. That's more than likely I'm going to get fired. So how do I afford to do this and leave the sheet metal shop, lose my position, have to work my way up again, somewhere else, because they're not just going to give you your job back because you show up again.
Right.
And so I go through all that, and I said, okay, well, and I arrive on a number that I put in there, and then I called him up. He gave me his home phone. Call me on his home phone. Okay. So I called her up. I said, Mr. Bennett, I got that budget put together. The internet wasn't around then, of course.
Oh, yeah.
No. Fax machines were. And I called him up, and he says, you got it all done? He says, do you have what you need in there? Yeah. He says, well, fax it to me right here. Here's a number at the house. Fax it to me right now. Okay. Because he wasn't a guy who used to hand out these little plaques that said procrastination, the avoidance of doing what needs to be done.
Mm-hmm.
He hated people that procrastinated about things. And so he says, send it right over to the house. And I says, okay. I had a fax machine, so I fed it into the fax machine. About 10 minutes later, he calls back and says, you got a deal. When can you start? I went, shit. My life just changed, And then a little while after that, Chip had put, him and Chip had to negotiate over what they were going to do,
Mm-hmm.
And Chip had given him some price tag, and I don't even remember what it was, for his contract to drive the boat and personal services because, he was being paid by Miller
mm-hmm.
at the time. And, so Bennett called up and he says, he says, you drove those limited boats, you set lots of records and stuff. Why don't you drive the boat instead of Chip?
Yeah.
I said, Mr. Bennett, I said, I haven't even been to these race sites. I haven't even built a propeller yet. I don't know anything about turbines. but I think I have the right ideas. You hired me to win a championship for you. This is the best guy.
Yeah.
There's a whole bunch of things I don't know. And he goes, okay, I'll pay him. And that turned out to be a good thing because I learned a lot from Chip over the next 2 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, anyway, that's a long-winded, what brought me from limited racing into unlimited racing.
David Newton here, listeners. I really hope you're enjoying the podcast. Roostertail Talk is a free podcast that runs off of, basically a teacher's salary and contributions from our listeners. If able, please show your support. To make a contribution, please visit our website at roostertailtalk.com and find the support tab. Thank you. Now let's get back to our program.
You mentioned a 3-year plan with Circus. I think you guys were able to accomplish that within 2 years, not the full 3 even.
Yeah, we really, by, building the first CNC propeller that was built, that gave us a big advantage.
Yeah.
The stuff that I'd learned with Ron and learned from model airplanes and all that and applied to that boat in terms of deck shapes and boat shapes and the wind tunnel work we did. We knew we designed the boat that we're racing today in 1988 because another friend of mine, Derek Rogers, was a guy that just came and knocked on the door and says, hey, I think I know, how to build you better cowling,
Mm-hmm.
And I says, well, okay, and he was a bright guy that helped us. We looked at the wind tunnel project, not how other people had. Other people went to the wind tunnel. They wanted to get speed out of the wind tunnel. In other words, let's go to the wind tunnel and make the boat faster.
Mm-hmm.
That's what everybody went into the wind tunnel to do that had gone in the wind tunnel. Where we asked a different question, and I told Bennett the same thing. I said, these boats are plenty fast enough. They just crash all the time.
Yeah.
So we need to go learn about how to make them more stable. And so we looked at that year. That's where we built a model that we could move the cockpit back. We built a model that we could take the canard out and go to a full, or make it. We didn't actually put the full flying canard in, but at that point in time, but we made it so we could take it out to see what effect that had if that didn't have it. If we moved the cockpit back, what effect that would have. And so we knew then how to build a boat. Trouble is, we had boats that were held together with 17,000 skin honeycomb, and if we built it the way we needed to, it was probably going to break in two, when Budweiser finally went to that design, about 5 years later, it broke in two or three times, and so, we had to learn that, and I knew, I couldn't do that all at the same time. Besides that, I was building the boat at the same time that we were putting it in the wind tunnel, so you couldn't redesign everything all at the same time and get it all down. And mind you, all this happened in like 4 months.
Right.
So, we learned a lot about the boats at that time. So,
well, you mentioned something there. I know you're an active radio-controlled airplane enthusiast, and you still fly to today, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, could you tell me a bit more about your hobby? I'm a modeler as well, but mine are hydroplanes. But I'm curious with some things like because you mentioned how you read so many articles growing up as a kid and getting into the hobby and learning more about aerodynamics and whatnot. So how much were you able to carry over from the models to that? And just tell us more about your hobby as well.
Well, the thing that's really cool about the modeling industry and the people involved in it is some incredibly bright people in all kinds of different areas of electronics and aerodynamics, incredibly bright people, and that also, and almost even more importantly, can communicate to a regular guy like you and me and have it all make sense.
Yeah.
So you can see what the point is. You can look at graphs and like one guy said, we're talking about lift and boats. He goes, remember, lift isn't a dirty word. It's just how we use it, and I always hung on to that. And we learned about shapes and, even like the hydroplane that Ron Jones, Marine and I built together in their shop there. even that, the sponson shapes hadn't evolved, and we were starting to talk about that. And in the flat bottoms, we had gotten too much lift by the deck edge of the boat, and the last boat that I set all the records with, we had modified the edge of the boat and changed it to change the shape of it. Mm-hmm. Then Steve had done a lot in his brother's boat in terms of managing how lift is derived and where the center of pressure is when he does that. And Ron Jones Sr. talked a lot about that. And, so, we learned an awful lot from the modeling, where people are talking about aerodynamics all the time and shapes and all of those things. And so, that modeling thing really helped, through, in its application to hydroplane racing. I also, as it happened, the circus team, as you talked about, it was supposed to go on for 3 years, but it went on for 2. And after we won the championship in 90, because Bennett called me and says, he says, I think we're going to quit while we're ahead. Because he was taking some pressure from the board of directors as to how much he was spending on the boat and whatnot. Okay. And he says, so we need to close down that operation. And, how'd you like to own that whole thing? And I said, Mr. Bennett, I don't have any dollars. He's like, oh, that's okay. He says, you can just pay me when you get a sponsor for it or something, and I went, no, I'm not, I know that just sounds risky, mm-hmm. And so, Chip and I talked, and we says, well, we knew that John Lovett was working with Penske, and he was working with Marlboro at the time. And so we says, there'd be a possibility. I said, I'd sign on the line if we had somebody lined up, but, I've managed to do well over the last couple of years. I put more money together than I thought I'd ever see over that time frame. And I'm sitting there staring at the shop costs $3,000 a month. Of course, that doesn't sound like much now, but back then it was. House payments were $300. Mm-hmm. Right. So, that $3,000, I went, boy, guy could go broke doing this in a hurry. Mm-hmm. And you can't it's not like you can just quit racing and stop. You have a warehouse full of stuff that you got to pay for no matter what. So we were trying to get Marlboro to do something. And finally, we got Marlboro to say yes.
Really?
Yeah, we got Marlboro to say yes. Yep, we'll take it. We'll put the deal together. We just got to sign everything up, which I didn't anticipate as a problem. So I called Bennett and says, hey, we put a deal together, that we'll go ahead and take the equipment. Mm-hmm. And he goes, well, he says, shit. He said, I just sold it to Woomer this morning. He sent me a check, and he said, I can't back out of that. And I says, okay. Oh, and that's the story about all of that. It was so close yet so far.
Man, so basically like hours away from happening. Oh, man.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you about that, because I always heard kind of tale of that possibly happening with Marlboro. And I just love the idea of a hydroplane with the same paint scheme as that Senna McLaren Marlboro F1. That would have been so cool to have seen happen.
Yeah, it would have been a cool operation. They were spending a lot of money at the time. And that would have been a great partnership, but didn't happen. Yeah.
Oh, well, there's a lot of things like that in the sport that didn't happen that could have, which would have been cool.
Yeah.
Well, there's so many things I want to talk to you about, but there's one thing I think is so unique about your driving approach with the various boats that you've raced over the years is that you understand the boats in and out so well that not all drivers do, right? So some drivers just climb in the cockpit and go, but you're kind of like a student of the sport. That you've taken the time over the years to learn everything, from props to motors to whatever. I just wanted to see if you can talk a bit about that and how that's helped your success over the years.
Yeah, I think it certainly has. I mean, I know a lot about the boats, and I've been lucky enough to be in a situation of that nobody gets to do anymore. Nobody gets wind tunnel time anymore. Mm-hmm. Nobody gets to go invent things anymore. And even if they did, they'd probably outlaw it. So I think it's been a big advantage for me to know more about the vehicle.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and like when we were running the circus operation, you know, and I was the backup driver guy, you know, and I would tell Chip, I says, I don't want to ever put anybody in a boat I wouldn't get into.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I could know and feel things that other people could only just try to describe, you know, and depending on how well the driver describes it, it's only as well as you can do. I remember one time that we were running the boat, and we had some of the new propellers, and the boat was a little too loose at the time. And Chip was always sort of, you know, I'm just the driver. He took the position, I'm just the driver. Mm-hmm. And he was good at, you know, rallying team members and rallying people around him. But when it came to setting the boat up and do things, he just wanted to be the driver. And I knew that if we were going to be successful, that I needed to get him vested into whatever we did to the boat was a decision and a way he wanted to go. And so he come back in and he'd say, well, the boat's a little loose, and, you know, and I said, well, what do you want to do? And he goes, well, I don't know. I'm just the driver. You know, that's up to you as to what to do to the boat. Mm-hmm. And I says, okay. So I, you know, ended the meeting and walked away, and I walked over to Danny, who's, you know, is a friend of mine, a longtime racing team member, my Danny Walters, and who worked on the team. And I knew he was a conduit to Chip because he'd worked with Chip for a number of years, you know. And I said, Danny, go down and take all the runners that we had on for Miami and put them on the boat. And he looked at me and kind of eyes got kind of big, and he says, well, you know, that'll make it looser. Well, maybe, but just go put those on. You know, and so he went out there and he got all of the sponsor runners out to bolt them on, you know, but I knew that was going to be a quick line to Chip. About 10 minutes later, Chip's coming. He goes, you're putting the Miami sponsor runners on the boat. And I says, yeah. And he goes, well, that'll make the boat looser. I go, oh, you do know about boats. So, and I says, look, if we're going to be successful, you got to vest yourself in this. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. What do you think you need to do? You're feeling what you need to do. You need to tell me that. We'll go look at data to figure out if data supports what you're saying. You know, mostly we're just going to follow what you say to do. Mm-hmm. And you probably know, whether you want to admit it or not, more about this thing than you think.
Yeah.
You know, and he goes, okay. And then they started working. That's why, you know, from then on, we just got more and more successful. So it helps a lot. The driver that knows what to tell you about what's happening, and Chip was really good. He knew a lot more about boats than he would say, you know, or tell the public. You know, he just wanted to be the driver and didn't want anybody to know that, really. But he was really good at knowing what the boat was doing when. Another thing that he was really good at that I, you know, and I followed suit in all of these things, you know, because I learned, mm-hmm. you know, that he could drive the boat very accurately. In other words, when he went out and drove the boat around the course one way, he could go out and drive it again in exactly the same place. Yeah. You know, and repeat his performances exactly. So then you could learn. You know, mm-hmm. if you couldn't do that, then a crew can get really confused. Yeah. You know, in a hurry. Yeah. And that's something I learned from him, and learned from that experience that I went, well, a guy has to pay attention to that. You know, mm-hmm. at the same time, well, through that time frame, I was sitting there watching Chip with one driving style and Tom Deeth with another driving style. Both were successful at times, but I could see that there was some faults with some of the things that Chip had done, and there was some faults, some of the things that Tommy Deeth had done. And so I went, if I'm going to drive one of these things, I got to be somewhere in the middle of that, you know, not to one extreme or the other. And so that helped me as well.
Well, I'm glad you shared that story with you and Chip, and learning that, you know, that process of the communication needed from drivers. I won't say any names, but I just remember I witnessed this at a race. A driver came back from the run, the qualifying run, and told the crew chief, you know, this boat runs like shit. And the crew chief said, well, you know, if I pull out my book here, I can't kind of find the chapter on runs like shit. I need to know more information than that.
Yeah.
You know. So
yeah,
it's
and I
just
said
such
the
a
same
crucial.
thing. We got all kinds of. At that time, computers. We had one of the first couple of computers in a boat. And every time you ran the boat, because of how they average information, they put like an inch of paper out every time you ran the boat for 15 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. And so I says, we have a lot of data here. I just need to know where to slice the deck. I can't read every number in here and learn anything in a timely manner. So the driver becomes really important to that, is to come back with enough information. And most of the drivers have they've got some boat building and engine building background, to some degree that have got them to that level. So there's a combination of that. Most aren't just the driver, period.
Well, in your career, you hold a lot of records for different things, but one thing that's impressive to me is you were the second to ever qualify over 170 miles an hour. And I believe, looking through the records, that you're the most to have ever done this. You've done this 3 separate times in your career. I want to talk about, from your perspective as a driver, also as knowing what it takes to prepare the boats, what hurdles did you have to jump to hit that 170 mark? Because we haven't seen it since, and I don't know if I'll ever see that again.
Well, the 170, of course, there was a little more fuel. I mean, we went at 4.3, and I've told some of the owners today, I says, we ran $170 on 4.3. Now everybody's running about 160 at 4.2. They really should be running faster than that. And I said that same thing to Billy Schumacher. I went out and I ran his boat, and I think it went 163 or something at Tri-Cities. Mm-hmm. And everything wasn't perfect. It was just getting going. There's a lot of things that needed to be adjusted. And he goes, wow, that was unbelievably fast. And I went, no, it's still slow. We're just a little better than we were.
Yeah.
And so to run those speeds, you have to be very accurate. You can't, like, I mentioned Glenn Davis's name. Mm-hmm. He told me one time, he came up and says, every time those sponsons hit the water, if you're wagging the sponsons in the air, you lose 1/10 of a second. Mm-hmm. He said, if you want to impress the crowd, you run the boat like that. If you want to go fast, don't let it impact the water like that. Just make it carry.
Okay.
And I remembered that, and so we had went out, and when we went 173, we could have gone like 175 if I would have wanted to press close to. I was worried about going over the N2 limit, so I didn't want to exceed the N2 limit and throw away the 173 for the last lap, or we'd have gone a good bit faster. But the first lap, I came around and I'm thinking to myself, man, I'm going to get this thing in the air and watch me go. And I came out of the first turn in there in San Diego, and there's always a breeze coming across that water there, even in the morning. And come across, and in my attempt to get the boat in the air, I got it too far in the air, and so it hit sponsons like 4 times. Well, so I go back and I says, oops, that was a mistake. So the next time I came around, ran the boat in exactly the same place, came out of the corner, got it down the straightaway, went, don't try to get the boat too high in the air. I'm telling myself, make sure the boat's just carrying. Listen to old Glenn, And so I do that, and 173 something pops up, and I go, okay. And I think the last lap I slowed down. Like I said, I was worried about going over the N2 limit. Yeah. And I came back in and I looked at that readout for those runs, because I used to ask the Budweiser guys every time we run, I want to just print out that run, and I'll just take it and go look at it. Then we'll talk about it, and so I would do that. So I looked at that run, and I could see the first lap, and the difference between I forget what it is now, but the difference between 170 and 173 and change was like 0.4 of a second, right? So you look at that run, and you think, well, I hit the sponsons at least 3, if not 4 So you know what? Glenn was pretty close to being dead on. I'd lost 0.4 of a second in the first lap by not being very, very accurate. Yeah. You know, getting all the boat you can out of it, but not making any mistakes and throwing away any speed. You know, and you have to be a lot smoother. You know, you're going into the corners faster. You're coming out of them faster. You have to make sure that your entry's perfect and your exit's perfect and you're not scrubbing off any speed anywhere. Mm-hmm. You know, and so in order to run the higher speeds, you have to just be more accurate. Yeah. You know, you just have to do a little better job. Because it doesn't take, you know, you make just a couple of mistakes and it costs you a half a second. Well, you can't make that up.
No. Yeah, you lift for a second. Yeah, you can't make that up in that lap.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I hope you've enjoyed our episode. Make sure you come back next week to listen to our next episode. We release new episodes every Tuesday at 5 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Also, don't forget to hit that subscribe button on your podcast player, as well as rate and review your experience. For more updates on Hydro News, check us out on social media. We're on the major players, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Roostertail Talk is also online with our website, www.roostertailtalk.com. On the website, you can sign up for an email subscription list to get notifications on upcoming episodes, Hydro News, podcast updates, and much, much more. Finally, this is a free podcast to all of our listeners. And if you're really enjoying your experience and want to help us to continue to grow and expand, please donate. You can find a link to donate through PayPal on our website through the support tab. So until next time, I hope to see you at the races.